For a long time, I thought I was simply building a better life, a better career, better habits, better discipline, better standards. What I eventually realized was that much of my adult life was actually spent creating distance. Distance from chaos, distance from noise, distance from instability, and distance from the version of myself that grew up believing life could fall apart at any moment. I did not understand that consciously at the time. I only understood the feeling. I grew up in an environment where chaos was the norm: financial instability, emotional volatility, constant tension, a religious environment built more around fear than understanding, a young boy trying to make sense of himself in the middle of all of it. For most of my childhood and well into my adult life, I carried a pit in my stomach that rarely left. I did not have a name for it then. I simply lived inside it. That kind of environment does something to a child. Not because my story is uniquely tragic. It is not. Millions of people grow up in difficult homes. Millions of people carry things into adulthood that no one else can see. But difficult environments shape operating systems. When you grow up around unpredictability, you become acutely aware of signals. You learn to read rooms quickly. You learn what draws criticism and what earns acceptance. You learn when to speak, when to stay quiet, when to disappear, and when to perform the version of yourself that feels safest. Sometimes you learn to curate yourself very carefully out of fear of being exposed as poor, exposed as different, exposed as not enough. That tension stays with you longer than most people realize. In many ways, I still carry parts of it today, but I no longer see that as weakness. I see it as information. I got my first job at 14, working breakfast shifts at an 8 days in motel. I was up at 5 in the morning, walking to work, bussing tables for several hours, then walking home to get ready for school. On weekends, my brother and I worked flea markets helping a family friend for $20 a day. It felt meaningful then. At 16, I got my first retail job at Burdeens in Florida. I worked every shift nobody else wanted: after school, weekends, holidays, but I wanted them because for the first time in my life, I was surrounded by people who seemed normal: stable homes, predictable lives, a different rhythm, a different signal. I remember thinking, someday I want to be normal too. I am not telling you this for sympathy. I am not telling you this for applause. I am telling you this because I know what it feels like to believe your beginning determines your ending. It does not. But changing your trajectory requires honesty. It requires work. It requires patience. And at some point, it requires a decision to stop unconsciously living inside the architecture you inherited and begin consciously building your own. That decision did not arrive for me all at once. Life rarely works that cleanly. But over time, I began to understand that structure and discipline were not personality traits for me. They were survival tools. Eventually, they became something more. They became a way out. I spent the next 4 decades climbing, watching, listening, refining. I learned how people moved through rooms, how they dressed, how they spoke, how they carried themselves, how they signaled confidence before they ever said a word. Retail taught me more than how to sell. It taught me how presentation works. It taught me how standards are communicated. It taught me that nothing is neutral. The way you enter a room, the way you dress, the way you speak, the way you prepare, the way you follow through, all of it sends a signal. For someone who grew up afraid of being exposed, that knowledge became powerful, maybe too powerful at times. I became very good at controlling the signal, very good at deciding what people were allowed to see, very good at making sure the outside never betrayed what the inside had once carried. That served me until it began asking a deeper question: what are you protecting now? Somewhere along the way, I began removing chaos from my life wherever I could find it. Chaos became noise. Noise became stress. Stress became something I was no longer willing to live inside. So I began building structure: rituals, standards, predictable mornings, training, nutrition, presentation, and self command. At the time, I thought I was simply becoming more disciplined. Later, I understood I was building architecture. Then came my divorce. Not a transformation overnight, not some cinematic rebirth. At the time, it left me emotionally exhausted and financially devastated. There were years when I lived on eggs, tuna, and rice, not as a lifestyle choice, but because that was what I could afford while digging out of debt. I never saw myself as a victim. I simply kept asking one question: what am I supposed to learn from this? That question changed everything. It led me toward books, reflection, self examination, and eventually Carl Jung. The first time I encountered Jung, I could barely understand a word. Reading him felt like asking a second grader to work through college level quantum physics. I knew something was there, I just could not reach it yet. So I moved on. Then, almost 25 years later, a Carl Jung video appeared in my YouTube queue out of nowhere. I had not searched for him. I had not been reading him. He simply appeared. I remember looking at the screen and thinking, hello, old friend. Let's see what you have to say. From that first video, I was hooked. Not because Jung gave me all the answers, but because he gave me language for questions I had been carrying for decades. Slowly, the scattered pieces of my life began moving toward each other in a way I could finally understand. Stoicism followed. And what Stoicism gave me was not a completely new philosophy. It gave names to practices I had already been building for years: preparation, discipline, restraint, structure, self command, awareness, and return. I had already been building Stoic architecture. I simply did not know it had a name. That is why I am careful not to present myself as a philosopher. I am not writing this series from the mountaintop. I am writing it from lived experience. I am writing it as a man who had to build structure because he did not come from structure. A man who learned that discipline can save you. A man who learned that where you begin does not have to determine where you go. A man who learned that the life you inherit is not always the life you are required to keep living. At 68, I do not look back and wish everything had been easier. A different beginning may have produced a different man, but it would not have produced this one. And this is the man I was supposed to become. The distance did not make me cold, it made me conscious. And at this stage of my life, I have come to believe that consciousness may be one of the greatest forms of freedom a man can build for himself.